I know that you're sisters, but did the two of you really fight? Huh. It just, no. Well, let's not start anything today. It's just hard to imagine the two of you are such lovely people, and I can't imagine that. But let's leave it that way. I don't want to think about the. This morning is Epiphany Sunday, and in reality, Epiphany happened on Friday. January 6th is when Epiphany is. And Dale, you didn't do a bad job pronouncing it, Epiphany. It is a word that comes from the Greek, phanos, which means to appear or manifest. And so it's where we get the word Epiphany from. Epiphany is an ancient celebration. Before we even celebrated the Nativity at Christmas was the celebration of Epiphany. And Epiphany was if you will, the original Christmas celebration. And it began in the second century, or the third century, excuse me. The third century actually is the years 200. So if that messes you up, that's how come I misspoke. But sometime between the years 200 and 299, Epiphany began to be celebrated, and in actuality, Epiphany was a celebration of Jesus' baptism, and didn't really have to do with the Nativity at all. But it was a celebration of the fact that Jesus came to humanity to be a part of our world, that he chose to show himself and come and be a part of our lives and in the world that we live in. And then about the late fourth, beginning of the 5th century is when Christianity started celebrating Christmas, or celebrating the Nativity, and much of that had to do with Constantine being in power, and the legalization of Christianity, that it became more of a public celebration, and all of that. That happened the mid 4th century, and then Christians were a bit more free to begin their celebration. So we started to celebrate Nativity and celebrate what we now know as Christmas. And so Epiphany became like a secondary kind of celebration. And realistically, it's not something that we really celebrate too much anymore at all. I kind of like the idea, though, of at least recognizing the fact that Epiphany does exist, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But Epiphany happens on January 6th, and if you want to just allow your imagination to go a little bit about all that, but Christmas happens actually 12 days prior to that, and so Christmas is the first day of Christmas, and so there's 12 days of Christmas and then Epiphany, all right? And so we sing that song, on the first day of Christmas, all that kind of thing, and about those 12 days leading up to Epiphany. Well, I don't know about you, but for us, Christmas is over. We took down our Christmas tree. When did we take it down? Monday. So we took down the Christmas tree on Monday, and all the presents are put away, and the decorations. We still have a few decorations up, but most of the decorations are boxed up and ready to go back into the attic and all that. I happened to call Dale the other day, and I bothered him, and he was just getting out of the attic from taking his decorations up to the attic, and I thought, yeah, it's that time of year. So, vacations are over and the kids are back to school, and unfortunately some of us are back to work, and all that kind of thing. And secular Christmas is over. And yes, if you run up the credit card and you put things on layaway and all that kind of thing, you still have the bills this time of year to remind you of Christmas. But Christmas is remembered now, not in such a favorably way. And so I originally said, or I said a couple minutes ago, that I like the idea of Epiphany, and the Epiphany idea of a message related to that, because Christmas really isn't over, and it shouldn't be. Christmas needs to be with us every day. Soon the calendar will be turning our thoughts to Easter. Easter happens on April 9th this year. And so Lent begins on February 22nd. So that's just a little over a month away. We'll be getting our minds thinking about Easter and Lenten kinds of things. But Easter doesn't happen without Christmas. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're expecting us to spend the next 20 minutes talking about or hearing the story about the wise men leaving their home and coming to find Jesus and that whole story, that really isn't my intent today, although their actions will get us on our way. What I want to focus on, though, is who are the wise men, or who were the wise men, who are the wise men, and what is it supposed to mean for us, right? I don't know, we go through, what did I do with my, we go through the bulletin, and the first thing that we came to this morning was the call to worship, and so I don't know how much you pay attention to those things, or, if it's one of those things that you do, but I intentionally chose that verse, or those couple verses there in Psalm 19 this morning, so that doesn't just happen. It doesn't just show up on something and I say, oh, well, that's the call to worship for today or whatever. That was purposely chosen. And our call to worship this morning said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." Excuse me. I don't know if if you had any thought, but again, that was chosen purposely because I want you to think about this idea. The heavens declare, the sky proclaims his handiwork. Day after day they pour forth speech, and their voice goes out through all the earth to the end of the world. Every day something is being proclaimed. Do we hear it? Do we see it? Right? And to be honest, how often have we, or do we, ignore what really is going on out there? Now don't get me wrong. If something really spectacular happens, we say, wow, isn't that neat? You see a beautiful color in the sun, in the sky, in the sunrise or the sunset, and you think, that was pretty cool. Or you see a rainbow, or maybe a double or a triple rainbow in the sky that, just doesn't happen all the time, and you think that's pretty cool. Now, sometimes maybe you'll think about God and what he was saying, especially if you saw a rainbow and the promise that that God made to Noah and all that. But by and large, we just think that was pretty cool. And, I'll offer up a quick prayer that, thanks God for letting me be able to see that today. And, we'll go about doing our daily work. But we don't really spend time pondering what it is that what is of God is being spoken and being communicated to us. And so that's kind of the idea that I want to encapsulate here today. Obviously, the wise men saw something in the sky, and they thought enough of what they saw that they allowed it to change the rest of their lives. They gave up their homes, their families, and their jobs and whatever, packed up and took journey that would take them maybe a year, maybe we're not exactly sure how long it took them to ride their little scooters across the desert and get to where Jesus was going. But it was a significant journey. It was a significant sacrifice for them. And so something spoke to them. Something happened to them that moved them from where they were to where they were going. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." And so while this is a negative viewpoint of what was happening there, Paul is proclaiming, or is saying here in this scripture, that we have no excuse about knowing who God is and what he's come to do and what he's expecting us to be because it's being declared to us through all of creation from the very moment that God said, "Let there be," right? And so it is being proclaimed, it's being poured out, and so we have a responsibility to see that, to hear that, and it's not just a picture that we hang on the wall and say, boy, that is a nice addition to my dining room or my living room, kind of a thing. And it's supposed to move us from where we are to where we're going, right? This morning, Marty talked about in our Sunday school class about this idea that the exposing the darkness and separating the darkness and moving us, and so we're supposed to change, if you will, to be the people that God has called us to be. So our text is today about some men who didn't ignore that proclamation. So these three kings, Casper, Balthazar, and Melchior, left their homes far to the east and rode their camels to Jerusalem to find a baby Jesus lying in a manger, to worship him and give him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, don't get too excited. I know that most of that is untrue. We don't know that that's the case, and most of what we know about the wise men in that whole story happens because we sang that song, right? And it's conjecture. We try to come up with these things, these tales, or tradition sticks with us, if you will. Some of our depictions and nativity scene depict all of that out for us, and the thought of that there were three wise men. We don't know how many there were, and we just know that there was an entourage of these fellows that came from the east, and they were coming to worship Jesus, the baby, the one that was born to be the King of the Jews. It's interesting. We're decorating the church this year, and I was came over to help out with that. But we set up a porcelain nativity down front here, and so we have a box full of these figurines, and they're all wrapped up in like foamy stuff and whatever to protect them and all that. But as we were doing that, I was like unwrapping everything like a kid, wrapping presents at Christmas, and I was handing them to Veda, who was setting up the nativity scene. She said, "Oh, we don't want that. We don't want that." Kind of a thing. So I have to wrap it up, put it back up. But there's parts of our nativity scenes really that aren't as truthful as that the scriptures tell us. There are things in there. So there's wise men. Well, the wise men really didn't show up at the nativity site. They showed up years later, maybe up to 2 years later at in wherever Jesus or Joseph and Mary were staying with the baby Jesus, and building their home or their business and all of that. And so it wasn't there with the shepherds and and all that went on, and so I found this interesting that tradition tells us that maybe even one of those kings came from Ethiopia. And so sometimes you'll see in your nativity scenes, now ours is the one here for the church is white porcelain, and so it may not be as noticeable or whatever, but sometimes one of those wise men is a black man, and to represent this tradition that we believe, or that we come to understand, or that we kind of fantasize about, if you will. So I don't know if you've seen that or seen that in pictures, but that's why we have one that is dark skinned. Well, what we really know about these wise men and that whole visit only shows up here in Matthew chapter 2. So just a few scant details there. So let us focus on today what it is that we do know. We do know that the Magi date from the 7th century BC. And they were a tribe. There was actually a tribe of people, and they were called the Magi, right? And so it was a name given to a group of people. They lived within the Median culture. So they were part of the empire of the Medes, if you will, Medes. And so they lived in the Median nation, and that nation was in eastern Mesopotamia. And what we know, at least at the period of time when we know it from, and that is from the book of Daniel, they lived up in the mountainous area, probably the northeastern region of Iran today. Up in the mountains, they lived up there, and so was a tribe of people. And this particular tribe of people became skilled in astronomy and astrology. And it's interesting to note that they even had a sacrificial system somewhat similar to the Mosaic one. Now hold on to that thought for just a moment. But the book of Daniel reports that the Magi, with their knowledge of science, agriculture, mathematics, history, and the occult, were among the highest ranking, most influential officials in the Babylonian Empire. And if you remember your stories about Daniel and what you know about Daniel, Daniel and we know the stories about Daniel in the lion's den and his 3 friends that ended up getting thrown into the fiery furnace. And some of you may remember that the king of that day had dreams, and he called on his magi to tell him what those dreams meant, and they weren't able to do that. And finally they were able to come to Daniel, and Daniel was able to interpret those dreams through God's revelation and all of that. Well, Daniel grew in favor with the king, and because of that, he became the head, if you will. The king Nebuchadnezzar said, "I'm going to make you head over the magicians, over the Magi," right? And so he became the head of this clan of people that lived in northeastern Iran. And so much we believe, now, again, we don't really have it written down, but we believe that much of what the Magi understood about God happened because Daniel ended up becoming the head, if you will, of that particular clan of people. And so, years later, when we come back and we say, hey, this is kind of cool, they had a sacrificial system that really resembles the Jewish people, the Mosaic law that God established with the Israelite people as he brought them out of Egypt, and all of that probably happened because Daniel was an influence over those people. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. And so now we're talking in this story happens in the New Testament era, and so centuries later, this story we're talking about the Magi again, and so we're talking about the first century BC. So at least 700 years earlier was the story of Daniel, and so up to the New Testament time, and that era when Jesus was born, these Magi still had these beliefs. And it's interesting because when the exile was over, that Daniel and the Israelites ended up in the Babylonian Empire because they were taken exile. The Babylonians came in and plundered Judah and carried off the people and took them back with them and infiltrated them then, into their culture, into their society, and changed in an attempt to change them and make them into good little Babylonians instead of good little Jewish boys and girls and all of that. But in reality, what we end up seeing is that God had a plan for that exile, that darkest hour, if you will, in the Jewish history and culture, that exile, that darkest hour when the people felt like God had given up on them and God had just written them off. God was still working, and I find that to be a bit interesting. That even in and through all that, God was still at work, working for their good and our good at the same time. Now, I don't know what the Magi saw that night when they were looking up into the sky and they saw a star rise or whatever to prompt them into their action. We're only told of a rising star in Matthew 2, verse 2, and it says, where is he, this is the Magi speaking, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. In one of my commentaries written by Matthew Barclay, his commentary lists several possible explanations, and I'm not telling you that it was any one of these, or it was just a thought. And I thought, as I was thinking about this and thinking about the possibilities of what could have happened or what it was that the wise men saw, he lists in there in his commentary, he lists 3 different events saying that it could have been one of those. But in 11 BC, Halley's Comet made a visit, and he was visible in the sky, and it would have, brilliantly shot across the sky for a number of months as it made its way through there. To me, 11 BC seems a bit early. We kind of believe and think that Jesus probably is born somewhere between 4 and 6 BC. So it's just a bit, unless they sat on it for a while and thought about what it could have meant, and then eventually it just sort of seems a little bit early. In 7 BC, there was a brilliant conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter that only happens, very, very infrequently. But the two of them apparently were superimposed, or the two of them sat side by side in some sort of helical. Some of the scholars actually believe that because Saturn is actually smaller than Jupiter, if the two of them sat side by side, you kind of get this fish shape, and there's some conjecture about maybe that's where the early Christians got this idea of the ichthys shape. Sort of seems like trying grasping at straws and all of that, but that happened in 7 BC around those times. And there's also note here that between the years of 5 BC and 2 BC, which kind of coincides with this the time when we believe that Jesus was born, that there was a weird anomaly that the star Sirius, the dog star, if you will, it's the one that we typically see in the morning, the very first morning star, if you will, when all the other, the blackness goes away, there's still that star hanging out there. That's Sirius, the dog star, the morning star, if you will. And it rose with the sunrise, and it was a weird anomaly. It happened on the very first day of the Egyptian month of Missouri, happening in those 4 years. And so it happened in the year 5 BC, 4, 3, 2, that it happened to appear like that on the first day of that month. And just so happens that Missouri means prince. And, and so, the scholars are saying, it must be it. They saw this star in the month that's named the prince, and must point to this idea of Jesus. We don't know. There are others that think that God simply caused his glory to shine, his Shekinah glory, like the one that was given at the time of the Israelites when they were being led out of Egypt. There was the pillar of fire. His glory shone ahead of them, so they knew where to go. To me, that kind of seems like that fits the God, of the Bible. He would make himself known in a way that others would just kind of scratch their head and say, "What is that?" And yet those that knew would understand, and So, but we just do not know what it is that they saw. But we do know that whatever it is that they did see, moved these men to act and think, and to pick up and leave, and we end up having this story here in Matthew chapter 2 because of that. So Matthew includes the story of the Magi here in chapter 2 in his gospel, and it's kind of interesting that between Matthew chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 3, 30 years transpire, and Matthew doesn't record anything about that, right? And so chapter 3 begins with the introduction of John the Baptist and his ministry to prepare the way for Jesus, and then chapter 3 ends with Jesus' baptism, and John the Baptist was the one that baptized Jesus there at the end of chapter 3. And then we move on then to chapter 4, and chapter 4 is where the temptation of Jesus, the Holy Spirit took Jesus out into the wilderness, and he was met there by the devil, and the devil tempted Jesus 3 times, and so we had the temptation of Jesus. And then right at the end of chapter 4, Jesus begins to call his first disciples, and then we move into Matthew chapter 5. Just bear with me just for a moment as I kind of go through the book of Matthew. And because we're doing this from the book of Matthew, because Matthew really is the only one that includes this idea of the Magi coming to worship Jesus. There must be a point that Matthew is making, right? And so in Matthew chapter 5, did you get there yet, Neil? You got to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is this big sermon that Jesus does for the people. We call it the Sermon on the Mount, right? And, and so for chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, all of those chapters is a sermon that he proclaims to the people. And so this sermon is, and Jesus' message to the world as he goes about, is the kingdom is at hand, right? John the Baptist was preparing the way for the kingdom to come, for Jesus to come. Jesus said, it's right here. It's just a moment of grasping. And so he spends his time, the Sermon on the Mount, on telling us how to live according to the kingdom, to live in this new kingdom. And then after chapter 7 and the whole rest of the book of Matthew is what it is that we do about this idea that Jesus came, declared the kingdom, and told us how to live. So we're standing at the crossroads. Remember, a month ago we had that message where Isaiah had brought the Israelite people to this crossroad between chapter 31 and 32. If you will, or 34 and 35, I think it was, where they had to either decide, which way am I going to go? Am I going to take the path of judgment, or am I going to take the path of justification? They're standing at the crossroads. Well, and in reality, we live in this after Jesus has come, if you will. The light has already shone, and the star has risen. Now, what are we going to do about it? Right? Are we going to look at it and say, that means something to me and I need to move. I need to do something different. I need to change about who I am, to live according to this kingdom and to be a part of it. And so all the rest of Matthew is how people react to Jesus being there, right? And for the most part, there's a lot of people that follow after Jesus. And so you can follow into one of three paths, right? And so here in Matthew chapter 2, he's kind of giving us this glimpse or this overall picture, if you will, of those choices. And so we can be like the wise men and say, hey, that is what God is saying, and I'm going to move, I'm going to change, I'm going to allow God to have a place, and whether it means me leaving and my job and doing something else, or changing my friends, changing where I live, and all of that. Life change decisions have to happen, and will happen because of Jesus Christ and what he has come to proclaim to us, right? And so, like the wise men, we can accept that change, and we can say, realize, I've been wrong. I've been living in the darkness, and I need to move to live in the light, right? Or we could be like Herod and be intimidated, right? Herod heard the news, and it is said that when Herod heard the news of this baby that was going to be, or who was the king of the Jews, it said that he and all Jerusalem with him were troubled, right? Oh my, what's going to happen, and he was troubled. He was intimidated by the fact that there could have been another king, and that means that I'm no longer needed, and this king's going to take over. And so, you get to the end of Matthew chapter 2, and what does Herod do? He goes and kills all the babies, right? I'm going to get rid of this before it becomes a real problem. But he believed that there was the possibility that this baby was the king of the Jews, but I'm not going to believe in him. I'm not going to change my life and all that. I'm just going to take it away, and so that it doesn't become a problem. And he missed, but and then you get the wise men, or not the wise men, the scribes and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. You remember, the wise men came to Herod and they said, where is he that's born King of the Jews? And Herod says, what are you talking about? King of the Jews? What is all that? And so he consults the scribes and the teachers of the law and said, what is these guys talking about? I probably didn't reveal his hand, but all along he's thinking, I need to find out who this baby is, where it's at, and I need to take care of this. And we know that in hindsight. But all along, the Pharisees knew about Jesus, right? They knew the prophecies, and yet they didn't allow any of that to change them, right? The neat thing about the star rising and the Magi seeing the star is that it was evident to the whole world. Everybody saw it, but nobody did anything about it except for those wise men. Jesus was born into obscurity. Even the people that were around that were expecting a Messiah to be born. I read in a different commentary, but that particular period of time in that world, it was, everybody expected God to come some way, somehow. Right? They just felt it. It was like this electricity, if you will, in the air. They were expecting it to happen. I know that I've made the comment several times, but they lived in a world where all the girls, the little girls, the little middle-aged girls dreamt that they would be the one to birth the Messiah. Right? They believed that he was going to come. And they believed that it was a possibility that God might bless them, that they might become the mother of this baby Jesus. They believed that God was going to come, that God was going to send his Messiah. Now, I don't know if it was just a political thing that was, the world was such a mess, and, and we just know that God has to come. Don't we live there now? Right? And, we live in a world today where we say it can't get any worse, right? And heaven help us if it does get worse. And we're living in a world where we're expecting Jesus to come back. Do we do anything about it? Right? Are we looking for the signs? I found it interesting, again, I just have to laugh how God does stuff, how the Holy Spirit works in and through this, and there's kind of like this ongoing joke between Marty and I that, somehow, some way, the sermon always has to do with the Sunday school lesson. The Sunday school lesson always has some way to fit into the sermon, and you think, not because I I really don't. I don't have time to pull out I probably should make time, but I don't pull out time to look at the Sunday school lesson beforehand. I don't get to see it till Sunday morning, and that's my fault. That's I probably should do that and be more of an asset to the Sunday school teacher and all that. But I kind of think that gee, I got the sermon I got to do. I got to put the bulletin together. All these other kinds of things that all that. Anyway, but there's all this stuff kind of. Anyway, I got a catalog in the mail the other day. And Steve was making fun of me because of the name, but it's called the CBD, not CDB, Steve, but CBD catalog, the Christian Book Distributors, and I happen to I gravitate towards David Jeremiah's works. I really like his stuff, and I like listening to his preaching and his teaching and all that. But he had a whole page of David Jeremiah, and there were 6 books by David Jeremiah in that section that were highlighted, if you will, to draw your attention to, that had to do with the end times, right? So we live in a world where we're expecting Jesus to come back, that we're living in the end times, and yet do we look and see what God is saying for us to do to usher in that? That was the story about the wise men. What are you going to do? Jesus is speaking from the beginning in all of creation. The creation continues to groan, continues to speak, and it says that in Psalm 19 that there's not a part of the world that hasn't heard. What is it that we're going to do about what we've heard? Now I've finally really got lost in my sermon and all that, but so we have this story in chapter 2, and again there's these three responses that we can come away with, and hopefully we come away with this response, and Matthew's telling us that our response needs to be like that of the wise men. We need to hear God speaking, hear what he's saying, and do what he's prompting us to do, right? And so we need to go and be like the wise men, be willing to tear up whatever it is that the foundations that we've got established, and go and be the people that God has called us to be. So they left their jobs and their existence, and so everything in what they did revolved around their ability to see and comprehend and act on God's guidance and direction. And really and realistically, you had the wise men that were leading a pagan nation, a pagan people, right? That was their job. And then you had the scribes and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law within Judaism that were supposed to lead them to the one and only true God. That was their job as well, to lead the people, and they were to be. They were the ones that were entrusted with God's truth, and so they needed to proclaim it, and they worked for Herod to keep him abreast of every situation and possible scenario. And obviously they didn't see fit that this was whatever happened in the sky. They had to have seen it too, but it didn't move them. They didn't think it was a threat, and so they didn't warn Herod about that. I wondered how many of them might have lost their heads that day. The heads will roll. I don't know if that happened or not, but you have to wonder. And so the point and the closing point is that we have every moment of every day, all of creation declaring God's glory, proclaiming its handiwork and revealing knowledge, if we would just have hearts to hear. Jesus said that wise men are those who not only hear the words, but do them. At the end of chapter 7 in Matthew, when he got to the end of his sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, in verses 24 and 27, or 24 through 20, Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27, Jesus told them this parable, if you will. And he says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like wise men who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." So who are the wise? Those who hear and do what God says. So will you be counted as one of the ones who are called the wise? because wise men still seek you. Let's pray. Father, as you speak and act, give us eyes and ears to see and hear your voice. May we not be threatened or indifferent about, but grateful for your mercy and grace to move us from death to life. Every moment of every day, your word goes out to mold us and make us wise to your will and desire for our lives. Thank you. Forgive our indifference in the name of Jesus. Amen. Will you stand and turn to page number 96 in your hymnals?